Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a show for anyone interested in cryptocurrencies and the future of money. Coming up on today's show, Project Talk, free aid, distributed ID, and Bitcoin neutrality. Listener mail, Litecoins, ASICs, and Bitcoin banks. My interview with Joe Cascio of the Bitcoin ID project, where we discuss his plan to take back your identity, eliminate site-specific logins, and put the spammers out of business by keeping your online identity in the blockchain. Today's horrible warning, Bitcoin ATM blows up. And because we just couldn't not talk about it, today's other horrible warning is CoinLabs sues Mt. Gox. What's going on here? We investigate. Visit us at letstalkbitcoin.com to subscribe for free to our twice-weekly show. You can also find us on Stitcher Radio or in the new and notable section of iTunes. In our continuing, quote, Can We Support the Show from Listener Tips series, we broke our 1 Bitcoin per show goal with episode number 3. So far, we've received 1.44051 Bitcoins from a total of 10 donors. Thank you very much. This included a single donation of 1 Bitcoin, and while larger donations are great, ultimately we can't expect single individuals to support the majority of a show. Please remember that even if the amount you would donate is small, with Bitcoin and a growing audience, it adds up fast. Since we've hit our goal, some fun things are going to happen, and the next facet of the journalistic empire rolls out soon. If you're brand new to Bitcoin and would like to learn how it works in more detail, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/learn to be directed to the Bitcoin Education Project, which I highly recommend. I'd also like to announce a scheduling shift. Our tendency has been to release Saturdays and Tuesdays. We're shifting it for host scheduling reasons to Fridays and Tuesdays. Speaking of hosts, if you're wondering what we look like or would like to learn more about either myself, Andreas, or Stephanie, check out the Meet the Host section of the site. Hosts have individual tip jars on their pages, so if you'd like to make sure you're rewarding the right individual, that's your destination. And of course, the show is nothing without an audience. Please share Let's Talk Bitcoin with anyone you think would or should be interested in the future of money. Let's Talk Bitcoin is released under an open source license which allows for the non-commercial clipping, remixing, and posting in any format or to any site you want, so long as you include a link to our site, letstalkbitcoin.com. We're also actively recruiting both on and off-air talent for this and other shows to come. Once again, if you're interested, please contact me at adam@letstalkbitcoin.com. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to explain complicated topics in understandable terms. That's really what we're doing here, taking the complicated topic of cryptographically secured money and helping people see what it could mean in their own lives. Joining me in our ongoing quest for clarity are Andreas M. Antonopoulos, an expert in decentralized networks and secure systems.
Hi.
And Dr. Stephanie Murphy, a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hello.
Thanks for joining me again on another episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. This has been a kind of interesting week from a news standpoint. The price has been floating around a lot. And a lot of that's being attributed to things that aren't really related to the currency so much as they're related to the exchanges and businesses that are involved in it. We're going to get into that a little bit later in the show, but first, let's talk about projects. What's on your plate today, Stephanie?
I'm really excited to talk about this on the show. I've kind of been saving it a little bit, but I volunteer and do operations for a Bitcoin-based charity or nonprofit organization. It's called Free Aid, and when you say it on the radio, it's a little bit weird because it's actually spelled FR33AID, so Free Aid, and that's the name of our website, fr33aid.com. And what Free Aid does is basically we go to Liberty-themed events and we support volunteers who provide first aid at those events. And Free Aid will give out just stuff that people need, sunscreen, bug spray, Band-Aids, just kind of first aid supplies at those events. We also do health and safety outreach to the public about how to use a defibrillator, how to do CPR, and things like that. And we also provide a networking space for healthcare professionals or people who have first aid skills that want to network with other kind of freedom lovers. And you can find out more about us, as I mentioned, at fr33aid.com. We recently announced that we were going to take the organization in a Bitcoin direction, and we were going to do most of our business in Bitcoin, use Bitcoin as much as possible because we really believe in Bitcoin, myself and my partner Teresa at Free Aid. This is part of the reason I'm going to be at the Bitcoin 2013 conference moderating this panel discussion about nonprofit organizations and Bitcoin and how those two communities can benefit each other.
That's a really fantastic project, Stephanie. I had no idea you were involved in it, but it's really exciting. I'm a American Red Cross certified CPR instructor myself, and so I would love to join your team and learn more.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that would be great, Andreas. I'd love to introduce you to my partner Teresa at the Bitcoin 2013 conference. You know, it's funny because when we announced that we were going to go in a Bitcoin direction with Free Aid, we got some mixed responses. We got some mainstream news coverage in the Huffington Post. They kind of wrote about us as, you know, using Bitcoin as a way to avoid taxes. Well, you know, we're a charity. We don't have a lot of assets anyway, and we really like Bitcoin, and we just want to use Bitcoin, and we think that would make things easier. We'd be able to focus on our mission more of helping people with first aid if we could do most of our operations in Bitcoin. So that's really where we were coming from. But the reporter kind of sensationalized it a little bit, and we got a lot of sort of nasty comments on that article. There were like 900 comments on the Huffington Post piece. But we also got a lot of Bitcoin donations. So, hey, you know, you take a stance on something, and some people like it, some people hate it. But I'm really excited about Free Aid.
There's no such thing as bad publicity, Stephanie, but there's plenty of incompetent journalism.
I think that one of the things that people need to keep in mind about donations and about charities with Bitcoin is that when you're talking about a charitable cause, in general, the ones that have the ability to really raise funds effectively are ones that have a large enough organization that they can afford to have employees or afford to, you know, have a structure through which they can collect those donations. So Bitcoin's really interesting from the charity perspective because it removes that sort of minimum level before you can actually start collecting and just makes it about your project instead of about your structure.
Yeah, absolutely. We had some really big problems with some of the legacy banking institutions too. Like PayPal has locked down Free Aid's account twice, even though our treasurer has submitted all the necessary paperwork and stuff, but they sort of capriciously keep locking it down. Makes it hard for people to donate. You know, they take fees out of it unless you have this IRS letter that recognizes that you are actually a nonprofit organization in their eyes. So we had a lot of problems with the legacy banking system, and that was honestly a lot of the motivation for using Bitcoin, because it just makes things so much easier. We don't have to focus on that stuff. We can focus on helping people.
From a practical perspective, one of the interesting things about donations through Bitcoin is that it actually creates transparency, which is sorely lacking in a lot of the non-for-profits. I also take donations in one of my other projects, which is not for profit. And, you know, being able to say, look, our entire books, our ledger is on the blockchain. You can see exactly how we're spending our funds. That's a powerful message of transparency and accountability. Perhaps that should be the focus for journalist stories on not profits.
I totally agree. That was really important to us too, to have transparency and let people see, you know, how much we're getting and from who it's coming from and stuff like that. And it's pretty neat because, you know, the blockchain kind of does it for you. You know, you don't have to publish a report about it. It's just, hey, check it out.
Today for Project Talk, I just wanted to give a quick mention to an open source project that's getting started called the Bitcoin ID project. Basically, instead of having a login with every website you want to participate on, a specific or multiple Bitcoin addresses become your identity or identities for any websites that participate in the system. There's been a lot of quick movement on the proposal, actually. This just came out last month, the original white paper on it. You'll hear more about this later, actually during this show, because I did an interview with Joe Cascio on the topic, which is where I discovered that it was such an interesting project.
Do you think that some people might have some objections to that because they want to use Bitcoin for anonymity purposes?
I think that it can be used for anonymity purposes with this. You know, again, just like a Bitcoin wallet, you can have as many identities with this as you'd like to maintain, but there's permanence to them because as soon as you create them and establish them, like I said, it's a little bit in depth once figuring out how it works. But once you do figure out how it works, it becomes very clear that it really gives you complete control of your own identity in really whatever form you want to have. And if you need to, you know, abandon something and walk away, it's not a difficult process to accomplish. Even if you're maintaining multiple identities. But the point is that it provides a barrier to entry, because right now, if you want to sign up for a website or something, really all you need to do is just have a random email address and there you go. But with this, it ties it to something real and it ties it to something that you can track over time. And at the same time, it lets you use it really anywhere you want to as an actual verifiable identity backed up by the blockchain.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, the project I'd like to talk about today is actually the presentation I'm going to be doing at the Bitcoin conference. This will be in just 12 days. And on Saturday, the 18th at 2:45, I'll be talking about Bitcoin neutrality. And the topic here is looking at how to make Bitcoin as ready as possible for mass adoption in a very sudden way, triggered by some kind of precipitous event, a currency crisis in a small country, devaluation or massive inflation of a currency, et cetera, et cetera. So the premise is Bitcoin has to be neutral so that it can be adopted in any geography, culture, economic system, or religious system. And there are a lot of preconditions to make sure that happens. For the most part, Bitcoin already meets them. The talk is about how you have Bitcoin ready so that when that precipitating event happens, mass adoption can occur. And it really recognizes the fact that Bitcoin isn't just going to smoothly grow on a nice, gentle curve. You're going to have this kind of tipping point effect. So that's the talk at Bitcoin Conference 2013. I hope to see everyone there.
Cool. And in case people can't make it to the conference, will that be videotaped, or are you going to recap it on the show perhaps?
I will definitely recap it on the show, and let's see what we can do about video and audio. Not sure what the facilities are like, but yeah, definitely.
We're going to be there with at least 4 of us, and we might wind up bringing one more to the conference too, depending on what's going on. And if we do, then we will be having more video coverage than we would otherwise. So I'm really hoping that we can get quite a bit of content from the Bitcoin conference, and I've been scheduling meetings with various companies and various groups that are doing launches for the last couple of days. So actually, if you're going to be at the Bitcoin conference and you'd like to sit down and have a conversation with us, we're going to be there the day before to have a bunch of meetings. So just email me at adam@letstalkbitcoin.com.
So guys, I got an email from a listener that I wanted to share on the show and kind of correct a little misinformation that I may have put out there in the last show when we were talking about altcoins and specifically Litecoins. I said that it wasn't really possible to mine Litecoins on an ASIC miner. And that's not exactly true. ASIC stands for Application Specific Integrated Circuit, I believe. And so they're really designed for specific tasks. The current ASICs that are out there on the market were designed and are being used to mine Bitcoins, which are mined on a different algorithm, the SHA-256, than Litecoins, which is mined on the Scrypt algorithm. So right now, there are not any ASICs on the market that use the Scrypt algorithm to mine Litecoins, but there could be. And that's the thing about ASICs, is they can be designed to do pretty much anything you want, like a lot of different things. So, you know, Litecoin itself is not really resistant to being mined on ASICs, but they would have to be tweaked specifically for Litecoin, and nobody has done that yet. I think it would be interesting to see when that happens, if it happens. I mean, there have been some problems getting ASICs out there just for mining Bitcoins so far, even though people have been really excited about it. There have been a lot of challenges for the manufacturers making ASICs to mine Bitcoins. So I'm wondering if anybody thinks it's worthwhile to design one for mining Litecoins. But the point is that it could absolutely happen, and that was a mistake on my part. So I apologize for that, and I'm glad that Casey emailed to correct us about that. We might be talking a little bit more with Casey, who emailed on the show at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think it's a really common mistake to make. And certainly it's something that I think we're all guilty of here. You know, this technology, there are so many claims being made about it. It's difficult to investigate them all to the level of thoroughness that one would like to do. My focus certainly has been on Bitcoin rather than the altcoins, because I think that the hurdles that are ahead of Bitcoin are regulatory in nature rather than something like based on the type of algorithm. I don't think that Bitcoin is super vulnerable to being hacked. It could be attacked through other sort of regulatory venues. From that perspective, you know, I mean, the altcoins are not that important to me in general. But to this point, if Litecoin does become a player, then I think that it's just a gimme that we're going to see ASICs if they're possible. I mean, really, that's what'll happen anyways. It's once you have a main blockchain, then you essentially have an arms race moving forward with the mining process. So whatever the mining process looks like, it's going to be optimized as much as possible, because that maximizes the return for the people involved.
And as people start to realize the value of whatever they are, Bitcoins, Litecoins, or maybe some other coin, there'll be way more of a profit incentive to up that arms race and make more efficient mining devices.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news. It's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
We received another listener email, this one from Ben. He says, quote, I was thinking while listening to the last episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin about all the troubles that exchanges are having. Maybe it's time to have an actual bank in the works rather than just a simple exchange. Something that will have relationships with U.S. banks and be able to trade currency with them, but if needed, also be located outside the country so regulations couldn't be so overbearing. I think that that's actually been tried a number of times. There was a project that came out called Clearcoin that was functionally a Bitcoin bank. But the problem with any of these banking solutions is that Bitcoin doesn't act like a normal currency, and so you can't have a normal bank that would deal with a normal currency. On the one hand, you've got the regulatory issues where the U.S. government and governments around the world are not really super excited to be dealing with it because it's competition to them in a currency sense. But then on the other hand, you've simply got that a lot of the banking profit models and business models just don't really work with Bitcoin. It's very difficult to make loans because people essentially risk their Bitcoins in a way that they really don't in a U.S. dollar denominated scenario where you have insurance backing it up and everything like that. What do you guys think? Do you think we're going to see Bitcoin banks?
I think Bitcoins eliminate the need for banks personally, but yeah, I mean, there are certain services that people want. Just having Bitcoins on your own may not provide that. It's really interesting what's going on with Ripple right now, which is sort of this peer-to-peer kind of lending credit network. You know, that could represent a decentralized banking system, not necessarily with Bitcoins, but with all kinds of currencies. Yeah, I mean, perhaps there are some services that something like a Bitcoin bank could fill, but I'm not really sure. I think we'll have to see as time goes on.
It kind of depends on what you mean by bank, right? Because if you mean by bank, if you mean a depository institution that keeps your money safe and provides a small amount of interest, that's really not necessary in Bitcoin. If you mean a lending institution that gives out loans to small businesses and individuals, that could be interesting, but banks in the real world, as we call it, don't actually do that anymore. What most banks do is they use regulation and monopoly power to suck off a steady stream of income off their loans, and right now, they're not really doing any loans. They're speculating on the stock market, enjoying their quantitative easing unlimited edition, don't do innovation, don't do lending, and don't really protect your assets when they're sitting in there. So an old style bank, what you only find today in community banks, credit unions, organizations like that still actually lend, that would be interesting. New style bank, a rent seeker that charges a lot of spurious fees, well, not so interesting.
You know, I think that you're right about the old style bank, where you're talking about something that is much more focused on security. It's just the type of bank that exists now, like you said, that really doesn't make any sense with Bitcoin because the model just doesn't translate.
I would like to see something like taking perhaps one of the widely spread online wallet companies, let's say Blockchain or Electrum or one of those online capabilities where you don't actually hold your Bitcoin, but it's being held for you. Now that can offer a great deal of security, especially for users who are new and really would not do so well handling their own Bitcoin client and wallet on a Windows PC, right? They'd lose their money pretty fast. So for that reason, having a depository bank that essentially manages your keys, manages your transactions, and deals with any regulations on your behalf, that's definitely a good business model. The only problem is you can't actually do that in the US without enormous capital requirements, which really are meaningless. So there's no way to go from small to bank, at least in the US.
You know, another thing that banks do is provide some level of insurance, I guess, against theft of money. And so I think people would be really interested in that. A lot of people would. There have been a number of high-profile Bitcoin thefts in a lot of the online wallets and from the exchanges. I think people would like to have a place where they could go and say, look, you know, we'll store your Bitcoins for you, and in case they're stolen, you know, you'll get them all back and so forth. I haven't seen anybody offer a service like that yet, but I think that might be interesting. And it's done without the FDIC. That's the other thing about Bitcoin.
Yeah, a pooled insurance fund between the various wallet holders would be very, very interesting to cover, you know, the 5% losses that occur through a pooled insurance fund. That would be very interesting. In fact, I think building a Bitcoin FDIC is more interesting than building the Bitcoin banks.
So now's your chance to chime in. Visit www.letstalkbitcoin.com and let us know what you think about both the idea of a Bitcoin bank or a Bitcoin banking insurance fund. Joe Cascio of joecascio.net to talk about his project involving sock puppets on the internet and how that ties into Bitcoin. When I brought this up with some folks who I was talking to about this interview, they said, are sock puppets on the internet actually a problem?
If you spend any time on Twitter, every few weeks there's another round of spammers, and the way they work is with sock puppets. Basically what they do is they have a bot that creates hundreds of fake accounts. They get about 2 or 3 spam tweets out, and of course everybody blocks them, at which point Twitter deactivates the accounts, but they're disposable. If they get one hit out of 1,000, they consider themselves doing well, and it's kind of like direct mail. The response rate or the hit rate on direct mail is, if you're achieving 1%, you're doing spectacularly well. For most, it's like 0.1%, and it's the same with spam. They work on the principle of throwing millions and millions of pieces out there and hoping to get a few hits.
So your project is targeted more towards reducing clutter on the internet, or is it?
Well, sock puppets also, people use them to do trolling and phishing, all kinds of bad activities. And for instance, if you're on some forum, if you have an account, and there are a lot of just really bad actors, spew bile over everybody and make, noxious comments and try to get into fights with people. That's how they get their jollies. If you have the capacity of blocking someone and they get blocked enough, then, they might get their account suspended. But if all they have to do is create a new account, they're off and running again. Sites have some limited ways of trying to deal with that. Sometimes it's by IP address tracking. Sometimes it's by cookies. Those can be fairly easily circumvented. It's just a way of creating identities more expensive. So the idea here is that if you have to pay for an identity, you're not going to create thousands of them and just throw them away, because now you're throwing money away. You're not just throwing computer time away with a bot. The idea here is to be able to, if you will, pledge or post a certain amount of money that's publicly visible, that's tied to an identity. And then one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is the public ledger. You can see how long, and you can see the balance history of that Bitcoin address from the time it was first seen on the net until the present time. It's possible to determine how long somebody has had a certain amount of Bitcoin in that address if they've ever swapped it out or tried to play games with it. So in other words, you can require to create an account, or you can require even for somebody to befriend you or follow you. It can be used in all those different cases. You can set your own limit and say, I'm not going to befriend or let through anybody who hasn't pledged at least, 1/10 of a Bitcoin for 2 weeks. That really cuts down on the ability of people to create these sham accounts.
So when you say pledge 0.1 of a Bitcoin for 2 weeks, what does that look like in practice? Where does that 0.1 Bitcoin go? Who's holding it? Is this tied to real names?
No. It can be. That's optional. The minimal Bitcoin identity would be simply a Bitcoin address. So a Bitcoin address is someplace you can send Bitcoin, right?
Right.
So if I create an address, which I can do anytime, I can create a new to address, if you will, for Bitcoin. And then from some other account that I have, I can send some Bitcoin to it. Now, that Bitcoin is still mine, okay? It still belongs to me. Nobody else can spend it. But I've now posted it to that address. Now, anybody can examine the blockchain. And if I give out that address, I can say, see, there's this much of a balance in it. And that's a function that's readily available out from servers like blockchain.info.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying then is you are taking some of the Bitcoins that you have already and you're sending them from one of your wallets to a specific wallet. And then you use that specific wallet as the proof that you're a real person. The assumption here is that if you're a spam network that's running thousands and thousands of identities, and most of them aren't going to generate any money, and most of them are going to wind up being thrown away pretty quickly, then it doesn't make sense for them to tie up money in each particular identity. Is that about it?
That's exactly it.
So I think I buy the premise here. How would a website that wanted to incorporate something like this go about it? Because like we're going to set up letstalkbitcoin.com as a forum partly. And so if we wanted to have users who didn't have formal identities, but instead, were able to be pseudonymous, but make sure that they were actually real people by using this system, how would we go about implementing that?
Actually, it turns out it's quite a bit easier to implement something like this than it is to do OAuth. You've used it if you've, for instance, signed up for an app on Twitter.
Okay.
So you enable the app to see your Twitter account, but you don't give the app your password. You tell Twitter, hey, this app is okay to access my account. That's OAuth. And I've had some experience with implementing OAuth on the server side. It's quite complicated. There are a number of redirections and callbacks that you have to do simply because of the way web technology works. But with collateralized ID, or what you might call distributed ID like this, my Bitcoin ID is my login. I don't have to store a password with the server. What I do is, because it's a public-private key combo, I can create a message and sign the message with the private key that goes along with it and send that to the server. That proves that I own that address. It's like logging in, but the site never has to keep a password for you, which is a kind of a big advantage because then they can't lose it or a hacker can't compromise their system.
It sounds like what you're saying is that all you have to do in order to implement this system is set it up so that your website is essentially referencing the blockchain and just checking to make sure the various addresses have, in fact, the correct balances as promised?
That's part of it. The other part is using that Bitcoin address as your identity on the server.
Now, when you say as an address on the server, do you mean that like that your public key would in fact be both your public login name and your actual login? How would that work? Wouldn't somebody be able to just copy your public address and then try to log in as you?
Well, no, because only you have the private key that goes with that public address. So just like you're the only person who can spend the Bitcoin in there, you're the only person that can log in with that ID because only you can prove that you own it. And it's a pretty simple matter to do that. It's much more straightforward programming-wise.
Okay, so let's talk about it from the user side. How does this look to the user? It sounds to me like you're saying that in order to sign in, you need to essentially go to your Bitcoin client and send not an amount of value, but rather a signed message from your Bitcoin client, and that would log you in. Is that right?
Yes, essentially, although you probably wouldn't use the current Bitcoin clients, they're oriented towards, sending and receiving money from other people. Actually, I'm working on an app for this, which would run on your machine. It would allow you to create new addresses, and it basically would keep in a separate wallet from your regular Bitcoin client. Let's say you could create several identities, one which you might use and might identify yourself. It might be a Bitcoin address and you might have supplementary information on there. This is Adam B. Levine. I host this radio show,
right,
etc. And so when you want to be public, you can be. But you might also want to have one that was, a pseudonym that you might want to use on, various forums when you sort of want to maintain a little more anonymity and you might want to get information that way or whatever it is you want to do. But the key to this is that the identities have permanence. Once you're logged into a site, you're not going to give up that identity easily because you've invested time in it and you've invested time to make a reputation on that site. So if you have a good reputation on that site, you've been a good citizen, you haven't trolled people, you haven't spammed people, that has value to you. You're not going to throw that away easily. in addition to its having literal Bitcoin value, it has reputation value to you. It's a way of creating an identity that you are more in control of rather than the site which owns it.
Right.
Like currently now, Twitter really owns your identity on Twitter, not you. But this is a way of creating an identity that really puts you more in control.
Well, and it still allows you to do what kind of has been useful about Twitter, because, I mean, I log into, I don't know, probably about a third of the services that I'm using right now using some form of either Twitter or another social network that allows you to log in with that. Just because it's so many less steps, I'd rather have my risk associated entirely with this one than spread it out to all these others that might not have as good a reputation. There are two things that jump out at me about your proposal, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Do you have any concerns about this limiting the amount of speech that people who don't have a lot of money can actually do? Because, you know, even if you're talking about a relatively small amount of money, it still is money that functionally just has to sit there and say, I am a real person, I am not a spam bot. And, you know, I mean, that's not going to be necessarily achievable for every person on the internet, especially, you know, younger kids and stuff like that.
Actually, there's two parameters to the permanence part of the identity. One is value, and the other is time. If you looked at it as the product of the two, as Bitcoin days, let's say.
Okay.
So then you could put, you know, 100th of a Bitcoin for 2 weeks, or you could put a whole Bitcoin for a day. You know, as long as the sum comes out the same, or some combination of. But you see my point is that it can be a small amount of money for a long time, or a larger amount of money for a shorter time. So it's like man hours, if you will.
So then what about the flip side of that? If it's a sum of those things, what if somebody who, you know, wants to say a lot of terrible things puts on, you know, 1 Bitcoin on a thing? They don't actually lose that Bitcoin. If the account is banned, they can still get it back and put it into another thing. So, I mean, doesn't it seem like I guess there would just have to be minimums. It would have to be like there would have to be minimums on either side of that, like 5 days on one side, and you'd have a minimum amount of value too.
You've got it exactly.
The time seems like it's more important, really, than almost the value does.
That's right. It really does. And, of course, everybody has time.
Right.
So you could, in fact, create an address and put a very small amount of money with it. Now, of course, the other thing is a site is going to establish their own reputation for you. So let's say you're the Bitcoin Forum, and you're a good citizen, and you make good comments, and you're a valuable contributor to the community. Well, the site is going to up your reputation in their eyes, regardless of how much money you have in the Bitcoin ID. So over time, you develop a reputation with that site. And then at that point, then users could look at the site's reputation for you rather than your Bitcoin value.
So if you go to a forum like bitcointalk.com right now, you log in, then you are essentially logging in, and that login only is ever going to work at that site. But it seems like the system that you're proposing here also has the advantage of turning these into kind of universal logins where you can have an identity and even your name carry over to any other forum just because you have this unique identifier that's tied to it and is, assured as you because of all these processes that we've been talking about.
Yes, that's exactly it. That kind of comes back to what I was saying about putting you in control of your identity rather than Twitter or Facebook. And this is really distributed or decentralized identity. All of the other identities that you have are only within the domain of the particular site you're at. So at Joe Cascio is only valid within Twitter because it's the namespace or the name domain that controls it. Similarly with Facebook or Bitcoin Talk. Yes, it really does put you in control, but like Bitcoin itself, it makes you now much more responsible for it. You have to protect your private keys, but, on the other hand, you never have to worry about a site getting hacked and your password getting stolen.
Right. It seems like it's all centralized on your local machine, so if something is going to happen, it's going to be because your specific machine was compromised. And I assume that, like the Bitcoin protocol, you're going to be incorporating encryption?
Yeah, encryption is central to the whole notion. It's what makes it work, basically. Being able to sign the message to prove that you own the address is part and parcel of that.
If somebody is listening to this and thinks that this is an awesome idea that they want to help you with, they can reach you at joecascio.net, which is joecascio.net.
They can go and drop a comment on the blog, and that would be a great way to get in touch.
Bitcoin itself is a really cool technology, but it's projects like this that take it and apply it in different ways. And, you're leveraging nearly every part of it, but in a really unconventional way where, no money and no value is actually changing hands. It's just performing another function. It's very interesting.
There are other things that can be built on Bitcoin, too, which uses mesh nets. Now, mesh nets are like voluntary collections of machines that relay messages between each other. And Bitcoin would actually make a way to reward people for running a mesh node.
How so?
If you think about the way miners work, Bitcoin miners, there's a reward. In other words, there's a monetary incentive for you to run a miner, okay? So mesh nets are fine, but people aren't all that altruistic where they'll let their server be used for arbitrary communications. With a Bitcoin foundation, you could build a way to pay people for running a meshnet node, which means that on like a P2P basis or completely distributed basis, you could set up a node and start receiving money by clients using it. You would be incentivized, for instance, if you wanted to invest some money to build a high-capacity node, just like miners are incentivized to build high-rate hashing mining rigs because you make more money that way.
It'd be like Bit Internet, where instead of paying for it up front, instead, as you use whatever the network that's available to you, you have like a certain amount of Bitcoins that are stored there, and for every, 10 minutes or amount of data that you use, it sends like 0.0001 Bitcoins to the actual server that you're using.
That's it. Yeah,
these automated payment systems, I think that could be a way, because you're right, it's this chicken-egg problem that you run into before that point, where there aren't people who know that there are servers to use, so the servers that are available to use don't get used, and then they're not, profitable to keep up and running because nobody even knows about the project. Oh, yeah, no, I totally see that working.
As we were discussing on chat just before we started speaking, underdeveloped countries really have an incentive. They have a really a better opportunity to do that than we do in the developed world. As you pointed out in your last broadcast, if you've got a 21 megabit download capacity on your cable modem, what the heck do you want to use a mesh network for?
Right, exactly.
But in places where they don't have that, or where it's subject to repression by the government or crime or whatever, that could be a huge thing.
Terrific. Thank you for joining us today on Let's Talk Bitcoin, Joe.
I'm very happy to be here and happy to participate.
Foxycart.com is a better checkout experience, empowering developers to create flexible, powerful, custom e-commerce in less time, while equipping merchants with the fastest checkout flow available to their customers. Foxycart is built for web professionals. It can serve as a foundation for advanced custom e-commerce deployments or for quick and easy, single-product online stores. And of course, Foxycart supports Bitcoin. Visit foxycart.com to learn more.
Sometimes even the best intentions really wind up going just crazy. And one of the projects that I've been paying a lot of attention to over the last, I guess it's been 6 months, is the idea of having Bitcoin-driven ATMs. Functionally that can accept dollar bills or accept, some sort of payment from your phone and give you Bitcoins. And then sometimes they work in reverse too. You can send them Bitcoins with your phone and they give you dollar bills. There are a couple of projects floating around. One of the most prominent ones was called generically the Bitcoin ATM project. They've been getting a lot of really positive attention, but it looks like that positive attention has actually led to parts of the partnership agreement kind of exploding. So Jeff Berwick of Dollar Vigilante posted about this after he was let go from the group. And I just wanted to read some selections from this because I feel like it has applicable lessons in it for a lot of people who are running Bitcoin businesses right now. If you'd like to read the whole article, you can visit dollarvigilante.com, and there will also be a link to it in the show notes on letstalkbitcoin.com. Quote, As background, a few months ago, I was approached by two young entrepreneurs. They had purchased a semi-workable Bitcoin ATM off of another entrepreneur and were excited about the prospects and approached me to help with marketing to the public and prospective franchisees, as well as garnering investment interest. It was a verbal handshake I had done via Skype from the jungles of Guyana while looking at a gold mining enterprise. I then set off on a month-long media sojourn, which had me in all the mainstream media promoting Bitcoin ATM and had been approached by numerous investors interested in the project. And then the 23-year-old entrepreneur, Evan Rose, who was half owner of the Bitcoin ATM, notified me a few days ago that my participation was no longer necessary. That was interesting, I thought, as we had had an agreement about my involvement and I had done everything I said I would do. It turned out that once I had put Bitcoin ATM on the world stage, he decided to take all that I had done and dismiss me. I do not wish to publish dirty laundry, and while the actions of the co-founders of Bitcoin ATM were incredibly dishonorable, I put it down to them being much like I was at 23, young, wise, and unaware of what they are even involved with. But it is my belief that he has no idea what kind of business he is trying to get into and how hard it will be to do without a number of the right pieces in place. After a day or two of pondering, however, I realized that this may truly be a blessing in disguise. The biggest issue with Bitcoin ATM, and one that I have stated in the past many times, is that it is hardware. Any government, anywhere, can come and take it away. It was always the Achilles heel of this product. Can it succeed? Sure, under the right guidance and a massive amount of capital, of lawyers to fight off every single country in which the machine is placed, and even then, there's no guarantee. Just look at Canada, which has already begun to shutter bank accounts of anyone even involved in a Bitcoin exchange. As I've also stated numerous times in the past few years, there's no real law. If there is one thing that my involvement with Bitcoin ATM has shown me very plainly in the last month, it's that Bitcoin has the direct attention of governments, central banks, and banks. It took them nearly 2 decades to figure out the internet would be their downfall. It has only taken them months to realize that Bitcoin could end their monopoly on money and banking.
I kind of wonder, do you guys know if the other people involved in that project have released any statements of their own? Because I'm curious to hear what their side of the story is.
Definitely just getting one side of the story here. No, I don't believe that anybody else is talking about it. They went into kind of standard shut up and don't say anything and hope it goes away mode. And, it probably will go away. But kind of the interesting part here is just this is something that I actually ran into with the Daily Bitcoin, is that once you start doing something that people think is really neat, then you start getting all kinds of attention. It's really easy to transpose that attention off of what you're doing and just onto yourself. And so that's what, from my read, may have happened, is that people just got so excited about all the possibilities that they, started saying, I don't need anybody else, and started pushing out people who are on the periphery.
It sounds like it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, and I guess we can use this as the sort of shining example or horrible warning thing that we talk about often on the show. You mentioned that there are other Bitcoin ATMs, Adam, and I just wanted to point out that, yeah, that is absolutely true. This project was being billed as the first Bitcoin ATM, and I'm not sure exactly if that's accurate. I'm aware of another company called Lamassu Bitcoin, who, good luck spelling that, but they did have a working prototype ATM that I actually saw at a conference last February, or this February. People were using it. They were loving it. With any ATM, there's going to be the same challenges as with a conventional cash ATM. So it has to be impenetrable. It has to be difficult to move. It has to be secure, unhackable, I guess, even if you're not going to move it. It has to be able to stop an attacker from being able to get the cash and or Bitcoins that are inside. I haven't seen that much about the security features on any of these Bitcoin ATMs, but I'm really curious if they pass muster, and it'll be interesting to see, and I think it'll show the value of Bitcoin if they are ending up being the target of thefts, because, people really want Bitcoins.
How would you even steal Bitcoins from something like that, though? I mean, I can see there being vulnerability if we're talking about something that is taking cash and storing cash. I can totally see that. But the Bitcoins, it's not like they're actually stored on the ATM. They're remotely accessed, and it's through an API, I believe, is how it works.
Yeah, I guess if there was some way that you could fool the machine into thinking that you had put money in, then you could just send the Bitcoins to your phone. It would be as simple as that. I'm wondering what kind of security features they have. And apparently this other company, Lamassu, has some prototypes that they're developing for commercial use. And I've, heard, I actually know the founders of this personally, and what they say is they want to see this in bars and restaurants, and they're going to let the franchisee, the person who purchases their ATM, set the fee on it. So that'll be really interesting to see how that shakes out.
There's a lot of potential security issues with this that I think have not been thought out quite well. Most of these examples I've seen present a QR code on a screen. That makes the whole process of skimming a lot easier. All you have to do is put a camera anywhere within about 100 feet of that screen that can see the screen from any angle, and you can scan that QR code and spend it before the other person has even had a chance to pull out their phone. There are some potential flaws here, and obviously Bitcoin being where the money is will be attracting all kinds of people who want to take that money. That is one of the concerns, but I would like to look back at the lesson of partnerships, because that's a lesson I have experienced myself. It's a very painful lesson to learn as an entrepreneur. And in my case, a 4-year protracted legal fight in court, basically over a civil suit.
That sounds awful.
A multi-million-dollar civil suit. So yeah, it is absolutely awful. Taught some good lessons. So here's my 2 bits of wisdom on this particular issue. First of all, anytime you have success, and we're going to see a lot of success and a lot of failure in Bitcoin, but there are going to be just as many companies that fail through success. Anytime you have success brings money, or the promise of money, or the potential of increased money in the future, and suddenly people you know and trust start behaving differently. Money changes people. Even good people start making poor choices. The problem is that it's very easy to find yourself in a misunderstanding where people assume the worst motivations behind your actions. You assume the worst motivations behind theirs. 2 pieces of advice. First of all, don't do handshake deals. If you're going into a partnership on Bitcoin that has any chance of becoming successful, and that's every single partnership of Bitcoin, make sure you have clearly set expectation about who gets what and what the exit strategies are. You don't want to be having that discussion when real money is involved later on, and that usually is how you destroy friendships and partnerships. Secondly, if you can avoid getting sued, avoid getting sued. In the end, it's just going to be a much more expensive way to sit down and have a discussion about it. So if you can, sit down and have a discussion about it before you're sued.
So the big news of the week, CoinLab is suing Mt. Gox for between 50 million and 75 million US. The basic facts of the deal: 1. Mt. Gox would transfer all US and Canadian customers to CoinLab and grant them exclusive rights to both exchange services and those customers as of March 22nd. And 2. CoinLab would serve those customers' exchange needs using Mt. Gox's service, but they're prohibited from opening a competing exchange. Basically, this agreement reads like 2 potential big players in the same space partnering up to minimize their cost and maximizing the impact of their shared market. CoinLab has lower costs and is not responsible for infrastructure, while Mt. Gox turns what would probably be a fierce competitor into a dedicated, autonomous marketing, customer service, and regulatory arm. The problem is, this changeover was supposed to happen on March 22nd, and for whatever reason, it didn't. Let's Talk Bitcoin will be featuring an interview with CoinLab on the topic, and we're still waiting for a response from Mt. Gox. Andreas, you've been in situations like this. What's going on?
I think the mistake here is to assume that this is about getting the $50 million or so, which is defined in the lawsuit as the punishment. That's the stick, but the stick is meant to bring both parties to the table to negotiate, and bring them to the table to negotiate in the context of the federal courts and defined rules of civil procedure. What that gives them the ability to do is forces them to negotiations in good faith, because if you don't negotiate in good faith, there are penalties. It forces them to use transparency, because if you say one thing and it can later be discovered through discovery that you actually meant another, that hurts. So, all of these things, some parameters. Think of it as a very, very expensive arbitration over the contract terms. Clearly here there's been a falling out. At least CoinLab isn't happy with the pace of transition. We can say that at the very least that's what's occurring, and perhaps there are some issues with Mt. Gox and its transition plan, or its willingness to do the transition. But at this point, this isn't a lawsuit where CoinLab wants to get 50 million. Don't misunderstand the goal here. The goal here is to settle out of court. 99.99% of civil cases brought in federal courts are settled out of court. And all this does is it provides a forum that says, look, we're serious. We want the contract handled properly. And this is what we're going to do if you don't.
Is anybody surprised that perhaps Mt. Gox fell down and didn't do what they said they would do or were supposed to do?
Well, reading through the complaint, actually, it looked like they were supposed to hand over. One of the things that was really emphasized in the contract between Mt. Gox and CoinLab was that there was concern on CoinLab's side of what would happen to CoinLab's ability to perform services if Mt. Gox, for whatever reason, was no longer able to provide them. And so Mt. Gox was supposed to hand over all of the YubiKeys, all of the... Basically, they were supposed to make all of the customers who would be going through CoinLab into CoinLab customers in every sense of the word, including access to the entire system, basically. Beyond that, they were supposed to provide a liquidity fund so that CoinLab could have, a buffer to float with. Again, since they're not providing the market services, they're just using Mt. Gox's marketing services. So, I mean, there are a whole variety of issues where it just appears from this complaint, and because CoinLab isn't operating right now in the way that they said that they would be operating, that Mt. Gox just really failed to deliver in a number of these circumstances. Andreas, do you think that something like this can actually help the situation, or do we just think that this is a continuation of that amateur hour thing we've been seeing coming out of Mt. Gox for a couple of weeks now?
Yeah, I think the 3-year-old amateur hour show that's been going on at Mt. Gox it should concern everyone in the Bitcoin environment, because this is not just a problem of technology that can only do about 30 trades per second, apparently, or the business practices, PR practices, and other things going on. It's the whole bundle. My account, by the way, is on Mt. Gox, so I have a personal account there, just in a matter of disclosure. I got a message saying that my account would be transitioned here to be located with Silicon Valley Bank. Now, to me, that's a huge advantage. Being able to attach it to a U.S. banking institution that can have direct access to my accounts, my other U.S. accounts, protected by FDIC, etc., all of those are pluses, and I don't particularly mind being in a regulated environment, because I am effectively, I have to pay taxes. I have to follow the anti-money laundering rules, whether I trade with Mt. Gox in Japan or CoinLab here in the US. The only difference is I would actually get some protection. So as a customer, I would hope that the eventual outcome of this is that they move forward on the agreement. It seems to me that understanding how these types of federal civil lawsuits work, that is the goal. This is not about making that punitive. It simply doesn't work that way.
Does anybody think that CoinLab could start their own competing exchange? Like, are they just so sick of this partnership that maybe they'll strike out on their own?
The prerequisite to that, Stephanie, in fact, if you look at the contract and the complaint, you'll see that part of the reason CoinLab can't do that is because that's what they gave up in this quid pro quo. So in order for them to get the deal with Mt. Gox, they've basically agreed not to do exactly that. Either way, this is going to resolve that question. Either Mt. Gox will put up, or the deal is invalid, void. There'll be some damages some way, most likely not 50 million, but there'll be some damages if it ends up voiding the deal. But what that also does, once that deal is voided, it allows CoinLab to go out and build their own exchange without getting sued by Mt. Gox for breaking the exclusivity deal.
Because that exclusivity deal actually went both ways. On the one hand, people have been talking about that $50 million figure as though it only applies to Mt. Gox, but it's only applying to Mt. Gox because Mt. Gox appears to be the one that broke the terms of the contract. If CoinLab had opened a competing exchange, then they also would have violated that clause and would have been on the hook for that $50 million for exactly the same reasons Mt. Gox is now, not fulfilling the terms of their contract. I have a kind of we've been talking about this off air, but I figure it's just time to do it. Does anybody here think that Mt. Gox is like a honeypot? Because I don't understand why they're still operating, given their just absolute continued record of failure with all the exchanges that are closing down around the world for random reasons. Why is it that Mt. Gox is never being touched by the regulatory side? They get hit by hackers every once in a while, but I mean that's totally normal, and yet they seem to be immune from any sort of actually outside regulatory interference. Are there any other exchanges in Japan that we know of that are able to operate because it's this great environment to be an exchange in, or is Mt. Gox special?
Not too sure about that, Adam. I do want to point out that from a legal perspective, I would expect within the next week or two, if this actually does move forward the way it's moving forward, we're going to see a countersuit from Mt. Gox against CoinLab for $50 million. That's usually how this discussion starts. I'm suing you, fine, I'll sue you back. And then they sit down and have a discussion about who dismisses first, under what circumstances. So the countersuit is coming. Don't assume that the $50 million only goes one way. We're going to see it in court too. That's my prediction. Now, on the topic of whether Japan's a good environment, who knows? I mean, I think it's pretty arbitrary. It's just a matter of who gets attention and when. If the Japanese government turned their spotlight onto, I imagine this is the big eye of Sauron, the regulatory spotlight turns around and starts looking at MTGOX, well, they could be shut in a day, just as easily as the US exchange, probably more easily. From what I understand of the Japanese justice system, they only move when they're sure to get convictions, and they get them every time. There's no traditional due process and assumption of innocence in the Japanese justice system, just so you know.
So as someone who has an account in Mt. Gox, and that's the case with me too, I've had an account there from time to time. Doesn't that make you a little nervous?
I have always been of the opinion that you never store money long-term in any of these accounts. So any money that's not in my own controlled Bitcoin wallet, I assume can disappear at any time, whether that's dollars or Bitcoin. So I put money into the exchanges, trade it, and take it out when I'm no longer trading. And I don't leave much in there. And I think that would be a sensible approach for anyone. When these exchanges go down, they take your money with them. And there's no reason why the fact that this one's been up for 3 years is any indication that it's going to be up tomorrow.
I think it's amazing that they've lasted this long. I mean, they sort of had an advantage, I guess, of being first to market and getting a lot of traction and a lot of popularity. But at this point, almost everyone agrees that they are not serving the needs of their customers. They're not even doing a particularly competent job at what they're trying to do. So it's high time for another exchange. People have been saying this for a while. There's going to be some other things that pop up, but they keep getting whacked down by these regulations. And maybe being in Japan is the key. I'm not sure, but I'm really surprised that Mt. Gox is still around and so popular.
Well, it seems like the main business here is to figure out the regulations, which, if you look at it from that perspective, what is the value in the MTGOX CoinLab agreement? CoinLab's already figured out the regulations. They've probably put down a pretty serious amount of money against that. They are VC funded, and they're FinCEN approved and got to deal with a bank. MTGOX brings to the table a trading engine that can do about, 30 transactions per second, which is about 10,000 times slower than any decent exchange. So maybe if we look at this lawsuit, we have to look at it from the perspective of CoinLab getting a out of this contract in order to build their own exchange, because over the last couple of months, while they were doing the transition, MTGOX lost a lot of reputation, a lot of credibility in the market, and other exchange engines are popping up. Maybe they figure it's not worth it anymore.
We're just going to have to kind of stay on this topic and see where it goes. Looking forward to hearing back from Mt. Gox, because, I mean, really the thing that we're missing in this analysis is their side of the story. And it would be fantastic if we could have that, because, I mean, I just can't imagine. It doesn't seem like it makes any sense to enter into these agreements or to say you're going to do things or to just underperform on such a regular basis unless, like, there's no other option but to do that. And I just can't imagine that being the case given how much of the market of Bitcoin they've captured. So I really want to talk to somebody from Mt. Gox and try and figure out what is going on. Why are these things happening? Why is this a normal thing?
Yeah, their official statement, again, left a lot to be desired. They really need to improve the PR. The official statement is we're not going to comment on these pending legal things because, we just got this and we just saw this. Well, that's not a very good answer. And they could have done better even in the first press release from that. I think CoinLab is doing the PR war, at least on this lawsuit, a lot better than MTGOX.
Well, and beyond that, though, I mean, it's not like they didn't know about this. Like you said, this is not a step that is taken, just because, hey, it's the most convenient thing to do. This is something that you do after you've tried to fix the problem over and over and over again, and it looks like you're at a point where it's not going to get fixed unless something drastic happens.
Well, the funny thing is they found out about this when a CNET journalist called them for comment, and I don't remember the name of the CEO of MTGOX, responded to the journalist that his call was the first time he'd heard of it.
Wow.
So the press got hold of this before the CEO, which, that's a whole other competence problem. But, overall, I'll go with the rule of thumb. Never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence.
And with that, I think we've actually run out of time for this episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Thanks again for joining me, guys, Andreas and Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into episode 4 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Whether you liked, loved, or hated the show, we want to hear what you think. Please send all listener feedback, comments, or questions to adam@letstalkbitcoin.com. I literally respond to every single piece of mail that we get, and it's actually not a small amount. If you're like me and you just can't get enough information and perspective on Bitcoin, check out our daily newspaper at thedailybitcoin.com, where you'll find the best news, presenting articles and arguments from all sides of the issue. Thanks to Joe Cascio, Andreas M. Antonopoulos, and Dr. Stephanie Murphy for providing content for the show. Music for this episode is provided by Jared Rubens, Nathaniel Castro, and Owsley. You can find links to the songs we use and the open source artists who make them at letstalkbitcoin.com/music. Stay tuned for episode 5 of Let's Talk Bitcoin, releasing late on Tuesday, the 7th of May, featuring an interview with Michael Hall, who gives us the inside story on Cyprus and the bailout that broke the world.